The bright lights of the university auditorium felt like spotlights in an interrogation room. Maya stood center stage, her beloved violin tucked under her chin, the same violin that had been her constant companion for the past 15 years. The wood felt warm against her skin, just as it had during countless performances before. But tonight was different. 300 people sat in perfect silence, waiting for her to begin. She could see her parents in the front row, her mom clutching the flower bouquet they'd brought to celebrate her final year performance. Her dad held his old camera steady, ready to capture what should have been one of the proudest moments of their daughter's life. The conductor raised his baton, and the orchestra behind her began to play. The familiar notes of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto filled the air. Maya had practiced this piece so many times she could play it in her sleep. Her fingers knew every note, every subtle change in tempo, every emotional crescendo. But as she lifted her bow to join in, something felt off. Maybe it was the flickering light above the stage, or the slight draft from the air conditioning that wasn't usually there during rehearsals. Whatever it was, it threw her concentration off by just a fraction. The first few notes came out shaky. Not enough for the general audience to notice, but enough for her to feel it in her bones. She tried to push through, the way her teacher had taught her. Even if you miss a note, keep going. The music must flow. Then it happened. Her fingers slipped on a particularly challenging run of notes. The sound that came out wasn't the beautiful melody she practiced for months. It was harsh, wrong, like nails on a chalkboard. She stopped, took a breath, and tried to jump back in, but she'd lost her place. The orchestra continued playing, but she stood frozen, her bow hovering uselessly above the strings. Someone's phone went off in the audience, playing a silly ringtone that drew nervous giggles from the crowd. A whisper started in the back row and rippled forward like a wave. "Isn't she supposed to be the best in the department? I heard she got early acceptance to the conservatory. Guess they'll be reconsidering that now." The conductor tried to help, gesturing to where she should come back in, but Mi's mind had gone blank. The notes on the sheet music in front of her looked like black ants marching across the page, meaningless and confusing. Her hands started to shake. In the front row, her mom had set down the flowers and was gripping her dad's arm. He'd lowered his camera, and the look of concern on his face made everything worse. They had sacrificed so much for her music lessons. Extra hours at work, fewer family vacations, all so she could pursue her dream. Somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, a phone's camera light went on, then another and another. She could practically see the social media posts being crafted in real time. The prestigious music department's star pupil falling apart on stage. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the conductor gently lowered his baton. The orchestra fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening. Mai looked down at her violin, the instrument that had been her voice, her comfort, her identity for as long as she could remember. Right now, it felt like a stranger in her hands. She managed a quick bow, more of a jerky nod really, and walked off stage. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. As soon as she was behind the curtain, she heard the murmurs grow louder, the unmistakable sound of people who were witnessing something they weren't meant to see but couldn't look away from. That night, as she lay in bed staring at her ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about how quickly 15 years of dedication could unravel in just 5 minutes. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. Instead, she got up and did something she'd never done before. She put her violin case in the back of her closet, behind her winter coats and old textbooks, where she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. The days after the performance blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Mai stopped setting an alarm. What was the point? She'd already dropped out of orchestra and canceled her private students. Her phone kept lighting up with messages, but she'd stopped reading them after seeing the video trending on campus social media. Someone had posted it with the caption, "Watch till the end. Guess not everyone's cut out for the spotlight." The worst part wasn't even the main video. It was the edited versions people had made, adding silly sound effects or cutting it together with clips from talent show fails. Her moment of failure had become everyone else's entertainment. Her tiny apartment, once filled with the sound of practice sessions and music theory recordings, now sat in silence. The only noise came from her typing as she threw herself into her other classes. Who knew biochemistry could be so interesting when you weren't spending 6 hours a day practicing scales? Her mom called every day. "Have you picked up your violin today?" she would ask, trying to keep her voice light. "Your teacher says you can still prepare for the spring festival if you start now." Mine would make up excuses. Too much homework, a group project, anything to avoid saying the truth. That her violin case was now buried under a pile of laundry she couldn't bring herself to wash. One afternoon, she ran into her old practice room partner in the campus coffee shop. The girl started to wave, then stopped halfway, her hand frozen in midair like she'd seen a ghost. She quickly grabbed her coffee and hurried out, nearly bumping into someone at the door. Mai stirred her untouched tea and wondered if this was how it would be from now on. People treating her like she had some contagious disease called failure. The conservatory letter arrived on a Tuesday. The thick envelope she'd been dreaming about since she was 12 now felt like a brick in her hands. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. They'd seen the video, of course. Everyone had. She slid it into her desk drawer, right next to the competition invitations she'd been ignoring. Her dad tried a different approach from her mom. He showed up one weekend with takeout from her favorite noodle place. They sat on her small balcony, eating in comfortable silence until he said, "You know, when I first came to this country, I couldn't even order coffee without messing up." Everyone laughed. I felt like going back home. He paused, slurping up some noodles. "But you know what? Now I own the best electronics repair shop in the district. Sometimes falling down just shows you a different path to walk." She wanted to explain that this was different. Music wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. Or at least it had been. Now she felt like one of those Russian nesting dolls her grandmother had given her. But someone had taken out the innermost doll, leaving her hollow. The worst moments were at night, when she could hear her neighbor practicing piano through the thin walls. The simple scales and occasional wrong notes used to annoy her. Now they made her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't name. Not quite jealousy, not quite longing, but something in between. She started taking different routes to class, avoiding the music building with its practice rooms and concert posters. But music seemed to follow her everywhere. Students with guitar cases in the elevator, the a cappella group practicing in the quad, even the subway busker playing Amazing Grace on a beat-up saxophone. Each note felt like a reminder of what she'd lost. One morning, she caught her reflection in a store window. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun instead of her usual neat style. But what struck her most was her hands. Her violin calluses were starting to fade. She touched her fingertips to the glass, watching her reflection do the same. 15 years of dedication literally slipping away, one cell at a time. That evening, she finally opened her laptop and looked at the video. The comments section was worse than she'd imagined. But among the cruel jokes and mocking memes, one comment stood out. "Been there. Sometimes the music finds its way back to you in ways you never expected. Just give it time." She closed the laptop and walked to her closet, staring at the violin case hidden behind her winter clothes. She reached for it, then pulled her hand back. Not today, but maybe someday. The tiny 24-hour cafe became Mi's second home during finals week. At 3 in the morning, nobody cared about viral videos or failed performances. They were all too busy fighting their own battles with textbooks and coffee cups. She liked how the barista never tried to make small talk, just slid her green tea across the counter with a tired nod. That night, she'd claimed her usual spot by the window. Chemistry notes spread across the table like a paper explosion. The cafe was unusually empty. Just her, the sleepy barista, and a couple of students huddled over laptops in the corners. The quiet held her focus until it didn't. A sound drifted in from the back courtyard, so faint she almost missed it. Someone was playing guitar, but not in a polished way her conservatory friends would. This was different, raw and honest, like someone having a conversation through music. The melody was familiar, but she couldn't place it at first. She tried to focus on her notes about molecular structures, but the music kept pulling at her attention. Finally, she recognized the song, Bridge Over Troubled Water, but played in a way she'd never heard before. The guitarist mixed up the rhythm, added unexpected pauses, threw in bits of other songs. Sometimes they hit wrong notes, but instead of stopping, they just wove those mistakes into something new. Without really deciding to, Mai found herself walking toward the sound. The back courtyard was small, just a concrete square with some mismatched chairs and string lights that had seen better days. A guy about her age sat on one of the chairs, eyes closed, swaying slightly as he played. His guitar case lay open at his feet, a few crumpled bills and coins scattered inside. He looked up as she approached, but didn't stop playing. He just smiled and nodded at an empty chair. Mai sat down, surprised at herself. She'd been avoiding anything to do with music for weeks, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was how he played without sheet music, without a metronome, without any of the perfect precision she'd spent years chasing. "Can't sleep?" he asked between chord changes. His voice was friendly, but not pushy. "Finals," she replied, holding up her chemistry notebook as evidence. He nodded. "I'm hiding from my thesis advisor. Figure she won't think to look for me in a cafe courtyard at 3 a.m. He switched songs smoothly, moving into something that might have been a jazz standard, but with touches of classical and what sounded like video game music mixed in. "That's interesting," Mai said, surprised to find herself actually meaning it. "I've never heard anyone play it that way." "That's because I'm making it up as I go," he grinned. "Half the time, I don't even know what's going to come out until it does. Drives my teachers crazy." The mention of music teachers should have made her stomach clench, should have brought back the memory of her disaster on stage. But his casual attitude about breaking rules somehow made it easier to breathe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, him playing and her actually reading her notes instead of just staring at them. When he started playing what sounded like a jazz version of a Bach piece she used to practice, she found herself humming along. "You've got a good ear," he said, adjusting his playing to match her humming. "You play." The question would have sent her running a few hours ago. But in this strange, suspended moment between late night and early morning, with fairy lights twinkling above and the smell of coffee drifting from the cafe, she heard herself say, "I used to. Violin." He didn't ask why she stopped. Didn't mention anything about viral videos or performances. Just nodded and said, "Cool. You know this one." He launched into another melody, this time a popular song she'd heard on the radio, but slowed down and stretched out until it was almost unrecognizable. As she listened, Mai realized something. For the first time in weeks, she was thinking about music without feeling that knot of shame in her stomach. The guy in the courtyard wasn't playing to impress anyone or prove anything. He was just playing because it felt good. Because music was meant to be played. When her phone buzzed with a reminder about her early morning class, she was surprised to find 2 hours had passed. As she gathered her notes, he said, "I'm here most nights. Sometimes other people bring instruments. No pressure. But..." He left the invitation hanging in the air like the last note of a song. Mai nodded, not committing to anything, but not running away either. As she walked back through the cafe, she found herself humming the Bach jazz fusion piece. The barista, restocking cups, was humming it too. A week passed before Mai found herself back in the cafe courtyard. This time, she arrived earlier, just as the sun was setting. The guitarist wasn't alone. A small group had gathered, their instrument cases scattered around like friendly cats. Someone had strung up new fairy lights, and the old concrete space felt almost magical in the growing darkness. The guitarist spotted her hovering by the door and waved her over. Perfect timing. We're about to massacre some perfectly good classical pieces. His grin took the sting out of the words. He introduced her to the others, a medical student with a saxophone, a literature professor with a small drum set, and a baker who played anything she could get her hands on. We call ourselves the Midnight Mixers, the baker explained, currently holding what looked like a miniature guitar. Because we mix everything up, and we only play at midnight. Well, and because someone, she glanced at the guitarist, can't remember anyone's actual name after a certain hour. Mai settled into a chair, expecting to just watch. But as they started playing, something unexpected happened. They were taking a piece she knew well, Mozart's Ein Klein Nacht music, and transforming it. The saxophone added jazzy runs between the familiar notes, the drums gave it a gentle Latin rhythm, and the baker's ukulele somehow made it sound like a beach song. That's not how it goes, Mai found herself saying, but she was smiling as she said it. Nothing goes any particular way here, the medical student said, lowering his saxophone. That's kind of the point. Want to prove us wrong. Before she could say no, the baker was offering her the ukulele. I've got my harmonica anyway. Show us how it's really done. Mi's hands shook as she took the tiny instrument. It felt nothing like her violin, and that helped somehow. She picked out the melodies slowly, the strings feeling strange under her fingers. When she messed up, nobody flinched or whispered. The drummer just adjusted his beat to match her mistake, turning it into a playful variation. As the night went on, Mi discovered a whole world of music she'd never known existed. The group played in a tiny jazz club where the ceiling was so low they could touch it, and the audience sat close enough to see every bead of sweat on the performers' faces. But nobody seemed to mind when notes went wrong. Sometimes people even cheered for the mistakes, especially when they led to something new and unexpected. They visited a late-night poetry cafe where musicians improvised backgrounds for spoken-word artists. Mai watched in amazement as the guitarist played along with a poem about city life, his music becoming traffic sounds, subway rhythms, and hurrying footsteps. How do you know what to play? She whispered during a break. I don't, he whispered back. That's what makes it fun. You just feel it and go with it. The night ended at an underground music space that looked like someone's converted basement, because it was. Students from all different departments gathered there, bringing whatever instruments they had. A physics major played classical piano pieces on an electronic keyboard, while a dance student added hip-hop beats from her laptop. A chemistry professor brought his cello and played rock songs. Mai sat in a corner, taking it all in. These people weren't playing for perfection or grades or future careers. They were playing because they loved it, because it made them feel alive. When someone hit a wrong note, they laughed. When two people played clashing chords, they turned it into a playful musical duel. The baker noticed her watching and sat down next to her. You know what I love about music, she said, pulling out her harmonica. In the bakery, if I mess up a recipe, that's it. Cake ruined. But with music, sometimes the mistakes lead to the best parts. Like life, I guess. As if to prove her point, she started playing her harmonica slightly out of tune with the current song. Instead of stopping her, the others gradually shifted their playing to match her key, creating something entirely new. On the walk home, Mai found herself looking at her hands. The violin calluses were almost gone, but maybe that was okay. Maybe she needed to build new ones, different ones. Her phone buzzed with a message, her mom, asking about practice again. For the first time in weeks, Mai didn't feel the usual surge of panic. Instead, she found herself wondering what her mom would think about harmonica music. The violin case was lighter than she remembered, or maybe it just felt that way as Mai pulled it from the back of her closet. Dust had settled on the black surface, marking the weeks of neglect. She sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, running her fingers over the familiar scratches and scuffs that told the story of 15 years of dedication. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the latches. The inside still smelled of rosin and wood polish, a scent that used to mean home. Her violin lay exactly as she'd left it, the polished wood gleaming even in the dim light of her bedroom. It was 3 in the morning, and she'd just returned from another night with the midnight mixers. They'd been playing a jazz version of a classical piece she knew by heart, and something had clicked inside her. Not the old feeling of perfection and pressure, but something new, a spark of possibility. She lifted the violin from its velvet bed, surprised by how natural it still felt in her hands. Her former teacher's voice echoed in her head, listing all the proper steps for holding the instrument. But instead of following those steps, she just held it, like the casual way the guitarist held his instrument, or how the baker switched between her collection of musical toys. The first note she played was terrible, scratchy and out of tune. In the past, she would have immediately stopped, adjusted, tried to perfect it. Instead, she thought about what the medical student had said about wrong notes just being right notes in unexpected places. She played another note, then another. No scales, no proper pieces, just sounds. Some were beautiful, some weren't, but she kept going. She thought about the physics major's electronic keyboard mixing with hip-hop beats, about the chemistry professor playing rock songs on his cello. Without really planning to, she found herself playing the melody from the cafe courtyard, Bridge Over Troubled Water. But as she played, other songs started weaving in. A bit of Mozart here, a touch of a pop song there, even fragments of the Chinese lullabies her grandmother used to sing. Her phone buzzed. A message from the baker in their group chat. Anyone up for a midnight session? Maya looked at her violin, then at her phone. Before she could overthink it, she typed back, "Can I bring my violin?" The response was immediate. Finally, get over here. 20 minutes later, she was setting up in the guitarist's small studio apartment. Her classical violin looked almost comical next to his beat-up guitar and the baker's collection of small percussion instruments. The medical student had brought his saxophone, and the literature professor was setting up a small electronic drum pad. "What should we play?" the guitarist asked. Mai took a deep breath. "Actually, I have an idea." She started playing the piece that had haunted her for months, the Tchaikovsky concerto from her failed performance. But this time, she played it differently. She slowed it down, changed the rhythm, left space for the others to join in. The guitarist caught on first, adding gentle chords underneath. The saxophone wove in and out with jazz riffs, while the baker added subtle percussion with something that looked like a tiny box she was tapping. The literature professor found a soft beat that somehow made the classical piece sound almost like a lullaby. When Mai hit the part where she'd frozen on stage, she felt her hands start to shake. But the guitarist shifted the chord progression. The saxophone player added a playful run, and suddenly she was playing through it. Not perfectly, but authentically. The music wasn't just flowing from her violin anymore. It was flowing between all of them, creating something entirely new. They played until sunrise, experimenting with different pieces, different styles, different combinations. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes it was a glorious mess, but every moment felt real and alive. As the first rays of sun streamed through the window, May realized she was smiling. Her shoulders didn't ache from tension like they used to after playing. Her mind wasn't racing with thoughts of technique and perfection. For the first time in years, she was just playing. Not for an audience, not for a grade, not even for herself really. She was playing as part of something bigger, something that had room for both perfection and mistakes, for classical training and wild improvisation. The baker caught her eye and winked. "Welcome back," she mouthed silently, then launched into an energetic beat on her box drum. May closed her eyes and joined in, her violin singing not with the voice of a solo performer, but as part of a joyful, imperfect chorus. It started with a phone video taken by someone at the underground music space. The medical student had convinced May to join their regular Wednesday night session, and they were playing their version of the Tchaikovsky concerto. The piece that had once broken her, now transformed into something new. The video caught her in a moment of pure joy, her violin singing over the guitarist's chords, the saxophone weaving through the melody. Her hair was falling out of its bun, her university sweatshirt was wrinkled, and she was swaying to the beat of the drums. Nothing like the stiff, proper posture she'd maintained for years. But there was something in her face, in the way she moved with the music, that made people stop and watch. Someone shared the video in a local music group. Then another person shared it in a larger group about classical fusion. By the end of the week, it had spread to music students across different universities. The comments were nothing like the mocking ones from her failed performance. This is what happens when classical music breaks free. Anyone know where these sessions happen? I want in. That violin player, isn't she the one who froze on stage? This is what a comeback looks like. The Bakers showed Mai the video during their next practice. Look at the views, 30,000, and the comments are amazing. Mai watched herself on the tiny screen, surprised by what she saw. Not a failed classical musician, but someone who had found her own voice. The video didn't show her mistakes, or rather, it showed how those mistakes had become part of something beautiful. Local music blogs started writing about the underground classical fusion scene growing in their city. They called her the violinist who bridges worlds. One writer described her playing as what happens when classical precision meets jazz freedom, a musical revolution in a violin case. The attention brought new people to their sessions. A flautist who'd quit music school because of anxiety. A cellist who wanted to play rock music but didn't know how. High school students who loved classical music but feared the pressure of perfection. They all found their way to the basement venue, drawn by the promise of a place where music could be both serious and playful. One night, as Mai was packing up her violin, a young girl approached her with a violin case clutched to her chest. "I saw your video," the girl said quietly. "I have a recital next week, and I'm really scared. My teacher says I have to be perfect, but..." Mai knelt down to meet her eyes. "Want to know a secret? Perfect music isn't always the most beautiful. Here, let me show you something." She took out her violin and played a simple scale, first with technical perfection, then with small variations, little slides between notes, gentle shifts in timing. The guitarist joined in, adding soft chords. Soon the baker was tapping a gentle rhythm on her box drum. "See, sometimes the best music happens when we let go a little," Mai said. "Want to try?" The girl nodded and took out her violin. Her first notes were hesitant, but as the group added their gentle accompaniment, she began to relax. By the end, she was smiling. That night, Mai got a message from her old classical music professor. "I saw your video. It's not what I taught you. It's something entirely new. Would you consider giving a guest lecture to my students about fusion performance?" She stared at the message for a long time. 6 months ago, she would have seen this as a chance to redeem herself in the classical world. Now, she realized she didn't need redemption. She had found something better, authenticity. The next day, she visited her parents for dinner. Her dad asked about the video, which had somehow reached their family chat group. "Are you happy?" he asked simply, passing her a bowl of rice. Mai thought about the young girl with the violin, about the growing community of musicians who'd found a home in their mixed-up style, about the way music flowed through her now, not like a perfectly controlled stream, but like a wild, joyful river. "Yes," she said, "I really am." Her mom, who had been quiet until then, got up and went to their old cabinet. She came back with a dusty CD. "Your grandmother used to play violin like this," she said, putting on a recording of traditional Chinese music mixed with jazz. "She always said music should be free. I forgot that, pushing you so hard. I'm sorry." Mai hugged her mom tight, understanding for the first time that her musical journey wasn't just healing her own heart. It was healing something across generations. The university auditorium looked exactly the same as it had a year ago. Same rows of seats, same stage lights, same slight draft from the air conditioning. But this time, as Mai stood in the wings waiting to perform, everything felt different. The event was called Breaking Boundaries, a night of musical fusion. When the dean had suggested using the auditorium for their performance, Mi's first instinct had been to say no. But the guitarist had squeezed her hand and said, "Sometimes the best way to face our fears is to transform them." Now, peering through the curtain, she saw an unusual mix in the audience. Classical music professors sat next to students with bright hair and band t-shirts. Her parents were there, along with her grandmother who had insisted on coming despite her bad knee. The young girl from the basement sessions sat with her violin teacher, both looking excited. Even the barista from the late-night cafe had shown up, still wearing their apron. The baker appeared beside her, carrying what looked like a new musical instrument made from an old cookie tin, ready to show them what real music sounds like. Before Mai could answer, she heard the dean introducing them. "Tonight's performance challenges our understanding of what music can be. These musicians remind us that sometimes the most beautiful harmonies come from unexpected places." Mai walked onto the stage, her violin held casually at her side, not the strict performance pose she'd been taught. The guitarist settled into a chair beside her, while the medical student stood ready with his saxophone. The literature professor had upgraded to a full drum set for the occasion, and the baker had arranged her collection of instruments around her like a musical garden. They began with a piece that had once been Mi's downfall, the Tchaikovsky Concerto. But this wasn't the version that had echoed in her nightmares. The guitarist started with a gentle rhythm, the drums added a soft jazz beat, and when Mi's violin joined in, it was with a freedom she'd never felt before. As they played, she noticed something in the audience. People were moving, subtle head nods, tapping feet, swaying shoulders. Classical music wasn't supposed to make people move like this, but their version invited it, welcomed it. Halfway through the piece, Mi's bow slipped slightly, creating an unexpected note. A year ago, this would have been catastrophic. But now, she just smiled and wove it into a new variation. The saxophone picked up her improvisation, the drums adjusted their rhythm. And suddenly, they were creating something that wasn't on any sheet music. She caught sight of her old professor in the front row. The woman who had once insisted on perfect technique now had tears in her eyes, a smile on her face. Next to her, a group of first-year music students watched with wonder, their concepts of classical music visibly shifting. They moved through their set list, Mozart mixed with jazz, Bach with a hint of blues, traditional Chinese melodies blending with contemporary rhythms. For their final piece, May nodded to the young girl in the audience, inviting her up on stage. The girl's eyes widened, but she grabbed her violin and hurried up. They played a simple student piece together, but with the band adding colors and textures that transformed it into something magical. The girl's initial nervousness melted into joy as she discovered how much fun music could be when perfection wasn't the goal. As the last notes faded, the audience erupted in applause. But it wasn't the polite, measured clapping of classical concerts. This was enthusiastic, genuine, some people even standing and cheering. Later, at the reception, May overheard two music professors talking. "This changes everything," one said. "We've been teaching music like it's a museum piece. Look, but don't touch. They've shown us it can be a living, breathing thing." Her grandmother found her, moving slowly with her cane. She spoke in Chinese, her words carrying years of wisdom. "Music is like water. Some try to freeze it into perfect shapes, but you've learned to let it flow naturally. This is how it should be." The guitarist announced they were heading to the cafe for a late-night celebration. As they walked through the cool evening air, May realized something. A year ago, she'd thought her worst moment on that stage had broken her love of music. Instead, it had broken open her understanding of what music could be. At the cafe, someone suggested they play one more song. As Mai lifted her violin, she looked around at her unlikely musical family: the guitarist who'd shown her freedom, the baker who'd taught her joy, the medical student who'd demonstrated balance, the literature professor who'd revealed rhythm in unexpected places. Together, they had helped her transform her greatest failure into her most authentic success. She played the first note, not knowing exactly what would come next, and that was perfectly fine. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from simply opening your heart and letting the melody find its way home.